The wind howled across the deck of Jin Sakai's boat as it approached the shores of Iki Island. The waves were restless, crashing against the hull as if they wanted to drag him down into the depths. Jin tightened his grip on the oar, his eyes narrowing as the fog thickened. A storm brewed on the horizon, dark clouds swallowing the sun. Even with the wind at his back, the island seemed to resist his approach, like a wounded animal guarding its last breath. Iki had always been a troubled place. During the Mongol invasion, it had suffered unspeakable horrors, burning villages, tortured families, warriors fighting to the death. But now it was said something darker lingered on the island, something that had survived long after the Mongols were driven out. Jin had heard the whispers in the villages of Tsushima, villagers who spoke of death in fearful tones, of bodies found in twisted, unnatural poses, eyes wide open, mouths frozen mid-scream, and always the same story. The dead had been haunted by a ghost, a phantom that stalked the night. The islanders called it the Lost Samurai, a soul bound by vengeance, forever trapped between life and death. As the boat scraped against the rocky shore, Jin exhaled slowly, grounding himself. Whatever waited for him on Iki, it would not scare him. He had faced death countless times and survived. He had become the Ghost of Tsushima, the bane of the Mongols. But a part of him, deep and primal, wondered if what was waiting on this island was something even he could not fight. Jin stepped onto the beach, the damp sand cold beneath his feet. The island was eerily quiet. No birds, no insects, only the wind whistling through the jagged rocks that lined the shore. As he moved inland, the thick scent of rotting wood and decay filled the air. Buildings, what was left of them, were abandoned, their skeletal remains jutting out of the earth like broken teeth. The sun had long since vanished behind the clouds, and shadows crept across the landscape, growing longer with each passing minute. A small fishing village lay ahead. Jin could see flickers of light in the distance, but there was no movement, no sound. He approached cautiously, his hand resting on the hilt of his katana. The village, like the rest of the island, seemed to be in a state of decay, but there were signs of recent life. Fish hung from wooden racks, abandoned halfway through the drying process. Doors swung open, creaking on their hinges as if the inhabitants had fled in a hurry. Jin's eyes scanned the ground. Footprints, fresh ones, leading toward the village center. He followed them in silence, his footsteps muffled by the soft earth. As he approached the center of the village, he saw a figure, a woman, sitting by a small fire. Her back was to him, her body slumped as though in defeat. Jin paused, watching her. She didn't move. Something about the way she sat was wrong. The air around her felt colder, as though she existed in a space between this world and the next. Slowly, he circled around her, his heart beating steadily in his chest. Her face was pale, drawn, her eyes wide open, staring into the fire. But her expression was frozen in terror, her mouth twisted into a silent scream. Her hands clutched her knees, her knuckles white. Jin crouched down, waving a hand in front of her face. She did not blink, did not breathe. He touched her shoulder, stone cold. She had been dead for some time. Suddenly, a low whisper carried on the wind, barely audible but unmistakable. It was a language Jin could not understand, a guttural sound that seemed to rise from the earth itself. He looked up, scanning the shadows around him. The village was still empty, still silent, But something was there, watching him. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as the whisper grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the edge of the village where an old shrine stood, its wooden torii gate half buried in the overgrowth. Jin rose to his feet and moved toward it, every instinct telling him to turn back. But he pressed on, hand on his sword. The shrine was ancient, forgotten by time. The stone steps were cracked, covered in moss, and the air grew colder as he approached. The whispering had stopped, replaced by a profound silence. Jin hesitated at the foot of the steps, his mind racing. Whatever force had taken hold of this island, it was tied to this place. As he took the first step, the wind shifted. The torii gate creaked, and the sky darkened further. Shadows danced along the trees, flickering unnaturally. At the top of the stairs, just beneath the crumbling roof of the shrine, a figure stood. Cloaked in darkness, it barely seemed human, a twisted shape with a mask of pure white, eyes black as the void. Jin's breath caught in his throat. The figure did not move, but Jin could feel its gaze on him, penetrating, cold. It was not of this world, and yet it had been waiting for him. Slowly, the figure raised its hand, pointing toward Jin as if beckoning him forward. His fingers tightened around his katana, but his feet would not move. He was rooted to the spot, unable to tear his eyes from the figure. Then, without warning, the figure vanished into the air, dissolving into the wind. Jin exhaled sharply, his heart pounding in his chest. For a moment he stood there, paralyzed. Had it been real? Or was it a trick of the mind, the island playing games with him? He knew better. This was no illusion. Whatever haunted Iki Island, whatever force had claimed the lives of the villagers, it was still here, and it was waiting for him to come closer. Jin turned away from the shrine, his mind heavy with the knowledge that his mission was no longer just about finding answers. It was about survival. The spirit that roamed these lands did not care for justice or vengeance. It only sought blood. The rain began to fall just as Jin entered the dense forest surrounding the ruined temple. It came down in sharp, cold droplets that quickly soaked his clothes and chilled his skin, but he welcomed it. The noise of the rain masked the oppressive silence of the island. The eerie quiet of Iki had burrowed deep into his bones, unsettling him more than any battlefield ever could. Jin moved swiftly along the narrow path, the forest closing in around him. His mind was still fixated on the events of the previous day, on the dead woman with her frozen, horrified expression, and the figure by the shrine, the way it had dissolved into the mist like a dream or a nightmare. But it wasn't a dream. He could feel it. Something ancient and malevolent stalked this island, a force driven by an insatiable hunger for vengeance. The villagers had spoken of it in fearful whispers. The lost samurai. But there was more than just a restless spirit seeking revenge. There was something else, something darker, something connected to the temple he was now approaching. Through the trees, Jin saw the outline of the ruined structure. The temple had been abandoned long ago, its once proud walls now reduced to rubble, overtaken by nature. The wind howled through the broken beams, carrying with it the faintest sound of distant whispers. The locals avoided this place. They said it was cursed, that those who ventured too close never returned. Jin wasn't afraid. He had faced death many times, walked into shadows no other warrior dared to tread. But as he stepped through the broken torii gate, a sense of foreboding washed over him, stronger than before. The temple courtyard was overgrown with weeds, and the stones beneath his feet were slick with moss. Jin moved cautiously, his eyes scanning the area for any signs of movement. The structure at the center of the courtyard was barely recognizable, a crumbling pagoda that had long since lost its roof. But in the heart of the ruin, standing untouched by time, was an altar. On the altar, half buried beneath broken stone and tangled roots, lay a mask. Jin approached it slowly, his footsteps careful on the uneven ground. The mask was unlike anything he had seen before, crafted from smooth white porcelain, its surface cracked with age. The eyes of the mask were hollow, black holes that seemed to stare into the soul of anyone who looked upon it. Yet, despite its age, the mask seemed almost alive. He crouched down, his fingers brushing the cold surface of the porcelain. A sudden chill shot through his body, making him pull his hand back instinctively. The air around the mask felt different, as if the atmosphere itself was bending under its presence. A faint whisper rose from the wind, circling around him like a distant voice calling from the depths of the earth. Jin hesitated, then reached for the mask again. As his fingers touched it, a flash of violent images flooded his mind. Scenes of blood, fire, and betrayal. A battlefield littered with bodies. A lone samurai kneeling before his comrades, his armor soaked in blood. The same mask was on his face, cracked just as it was now, but glowing with an unnatural light. The vision vanished as quickly as it had come, leaving Jin breathless. He tightened his grip on the mask and stood, staring at it in his hands. There was no mistaking it. This mask had once belonged to the lost samurai, the one who now haunted Iki Island. But there was something more. This mask held a power, a dark curse that extended beyond the samurai's death. Jin could feel it pulsing in his hands, as if the spirit of the betrayed warrior was trapped within it, waiting to be released. As Jin studied the mask, the rain slowed to a soft drizzle, and a low rustling sound came from the trees behind him. His hand instinctively went to his katana, his senses heightened. Something, or someone, was watching him. Jin turned sharply, drawing his blade in one fluid motion, but there was nothing there. Only the dense forest, the thick fog rolling in once more. Yet the rustling continued, growing louder, closer. He took a step back, his grip tightening on the mask. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was an old man, his clothes ragged and torn, his skin weathered by years of exposure to the elements. His eyes were wide with fear, and his hands shook as he approached Jin. "You mustn't touch it," the old man rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "The mask, it is cursed." Jin studied the man carefully. "Who are you?" he asked, keeping his katana at the ready. The old man took another step forward, but his eyes remained fixed on the mask. "I was once the keeper of this temple," he said. "Before the war, before everything fell apart. I have seen what that mask can do, how it twists the mind, how it poisons the soul." Jin frowned. "The lost samurai. This mask belonged to him." The old man nodded slowly, his expression grim. "He was a warrior, yes, a man of great skill, but his heart was corrupted by greed and betrayal. He turned against his comrades, led them into an ambush by the Mongols. But they discovered his treachery and killed him here, on this very ground. His rage has not left this place. His soul is bound to the mask, and now anyone who wears it suffers his fate." Jin looked down at the mask in his hands. The vision of the bloodied battlefield flashed in his mind again. the same betrayal, the same death. The mask, it seemed, was more than just a relic. It was a vessel, a conduit for the samurai's spirit. "How do I destroy it?" Jin asked, his voice firm. "How do I free this island from his curse?" The old man shook his head, his eyes full of sorrow. "You cannot destroy it. The mask is bound to the soul of the samurai. If you destroy the mask, you destroy him. But the spirit will not go willingly. It will fight you, and it will take you with it." Jin stared at the mask, feeling its weight in his hands. The porcelain was cold, unnaturally so, and he could feel the pulse of the cursed energy within it. He knew the old man was right. The spirit would not go quietly. But if he left the mask, if he did nothing, the spirit's curse would continue to spread, claiming more lives with each passing day. "I will put an end to this," Jin said, his voice low but resolute. "One way or another." The old man's gaze softened, a flicker of hope in his tired eyes. "Then may the gods be with you, Ghost of Tsushima. You will need their strength for what lies ahead." With that, the old man turned and disappeared back into the mist, leaving Jin alone with the cursed mask. Jin looked down at the porcelain face in his hands once more. The black eyes stared back at him, empty and hollow, yet filled with centuries of pain and fury. The wind howled, and the forest seemed to close in around him. The whispers returned, louder now, more insistent. The curse had been awoken, and now Jin would have to face the full wrath of the lost samurai. The wind had shifted by the time Jin left the temple, carrying with it a chill that clawed through his armor and gnawed at his bones. He tightened his grip on the cursed mask as he walked, its cold porcelain seeping into his skin. Every step echoed with the distant whispers that had plagued him since he first touched the mask. They had grown louder, more insistent, a faint murmuring that never left his mind. But beneath the ghostly voices, something else stirred, something darker. Jin had been haunted by betrayal before. He had learned to live with it, to carry it like a weight around his neck. But the story of the lost samurai, the spirit that now haunted Iki Island, felt all too familiar. As he moved through the dense forest toward the estate of Lord Ito, a former warlord now hiding from the spirit's wrath, he couldn't help but feel a connection to the tale. The lost samurai had been betrayed by his own men, cut down in cold blood by the people he trusted most. And now those same men were dying, one by one, in gruesome, inexplicable ways. Jin reached a clearing where the forest opened to reveal a large estate, its high walls rising above the surrounding trees. Lanterns flickered in the evening fog, casting long shadows across the ground. The estate was fortified, guarded by men whose fear was palpable even from a distance. Jin could see them patrolling the walls, their hands clenched tightly around their weapons, eyes darting nervously to the mist that swirled around them. They were not afraid of invaders. They were afraid of what was already inside. Jin approached the gate, and one of the guards stepped forward, his eyes wide with recognition. "Ghost," the guard muttered, his voice thick with disbelief. "You've come to help us." "Take me to Lord Ito," Jin said coldly. There was no need for small talk. Time was running out. The guard hesitated, glancing back at his comrades before nodding and opening the gate. "Follow me," he said, his voice wavering. As Jin stepped inside, he could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy like the fog that rolled off the sea. Every corner of the estate seemed to vibrate with fear, and the whispers were louder here, stronger, more malevolent. The guard led Jin through the courtyard, past rows of deserted barracks and abandoned training grounds, to the main hall of the estate. There, seated at the end of a long table, was Lord Ito, a man once feared and respected across the island. But the man before Jin now was nothing like the stories had painted him. His face was pale, gaunt, with deep lines etched into his skin. His hands trembled as he lifted a cup of sake to his lips, his eyes hollow with sleeplessness. "Ghost," Lord Ito rasped, setting the cup down with a shaky hand. "I had hoped you would come. The others, they're all dead. Only I remain." Jin stepped forward, placing the cursed mask on the table between them. Lord Ito recoiled at the sight of it, his eyes widening in horror. "The mask," he whispered. "You found it." "Tell me about the lost samurai," Jin demanded, his voice low, controlled. "Tell me about the betrayal." Lord Ito's face paled even further, and his hands gripped the edge of the table as though to steady himself. "We thought we could control him," Ito began, his voice trembling. "He was powerful, a great warrior but reckless. He sided with the Mongols during the invasion, convinced that joining them would save our island from destruction. But we knew the truth. We knew the Mongols would turn on us as soon as they no longer needed him." Jin's eyes narrowed. "So you betrayed him?" "It wasn't betrayal," Ito snapped, his voice breaking. "It was survival. He would have led us all to ruin. We had no choice but to cut him down before he could bring the Mongols to our doorstep. We lured him to Ghost's Peak, told him we would negotiate with the Mongols. But instead, we ambushed him. We killed him there in the shadow of the mountain." Jin felt a cold fury rising inside him. The scene from the vision flashed in his mind again. The lone samurai kneeling in the blood-soaked mud, betrayed by those he had once called comrades. It was the same everywhere: power, fear, and betrayal. The island had never been free of it. "And now his spirit hunts you," Jin said, his voice quiet but firm, "seeking revenge for what you did." Lord Ito shuddered, his eyes darting around the room as if the ghost might appear at any moment. "He's killed all the others," he whispered, his voice shaking. "My men, my family, they're all dead. He comes in the night, a shadow, a whisper in the dark. There's no escaping him. I thought if I fortified the estate, if I kept enough guards—" "You cannot hide from a vengeful spirit," Jin interrupted, his tone flat. "The mask holds his soul, and as long as it remains intact, he will continue to hunt you." Lord Ito's hands trembled as he stared at the mask, his fear turning to desperation. "Destroy it," he pleaded. "Please, destroy it before he comes for me." Jin reached out, his fingers brushing the cold porcelain once again. The moment his skin touched the mask, the whispers surged in his mind, louder, angrier. The images of the betrayal flickered once more, but now they were clearer, sharper. He saw the faces of the men who had killed the lost samurai, saw them laughing as they drove their blades into his body. And among them, Lord Ito stood, watching, his sword still clean. "You don't deserve a warrior's mercy," Jin said, his voice cold, devoid of sympathy. Lord Ito's eyes widened, his breath quickening. "Please," he begged, scrambling to his feet. "I did what I had to." Before he could finish, the lanterns in the room flickered violently, and a cold gust of wind swept through the hall. The whispers that had been gnawing at Jin's mind were suddenly everywhere, surrounding him, echoing off the walls. The temperature dropped, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, shifting unnaturally. Jin turned, his katana at the ready, his muscles tense. He could feel it, the presence. The lost samurai had come for Lord Ito. The figure appeared at the far end of the room, materializing out of the darkness like a wraith. It wore the same mask Jin had found, its body cloaked in tattered armor, stained with the blood of countless battles. The air grew thick with a palpable sense of rage, and the whispers turned into a deafening roar. The ghost's eyes, empty black voids, locked onto Lord Ito, who had fallen to his knees, shaking uncontrollably. Jin stepped between them, his katana drawn. "It ends here," he said, his voice steady, though every instinct told him to flee. The ghost didn't respond, didn't even seem to acknowledge Jin's presence. It moved forward, its form shifting like smoke, its gaze fixed solely on Lord Ito. The old warlord sobbed, crawling backward in a futile attempt to escape. But there was no escape. Not from this. With a sudden, inhuman speed, the ghost lunged toward Lord Ito. Jin moved to intercept, his blade slicing through the air, but it passed through the spirit like mist. The ghost ignored Jin's attack, its focus solely on its target. Lord Ito screamed as the spirit descended upon him, its shadowy form enveloping him like a shroud. Jin watched in horror as the old man's body convulsed, his eyes rolling back into his head. And then, with one final blood-curdling scream, Lord Ito's body went limp. The ghost lingered for a moment, standing over its victim, before slowly turning to face Jin. For the first time, Jin felt the full weight of the spirit's gaze upon him. The air around him grew colder, and the whispers filled his mind with a single, unmistakable message. "You are next." And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the ghost was gone, leaving Jin standing alone in the hall, the cursed mask still clenched tightly in his hand. Jin sheathed his katana, his heart pounding. He had seen the ghost's fury, witnessed its unstoppable thirst for vengeance. And now he understood what must be done. The mask had to be destroyed, but the spirit would not allow it to happen easily. Jin looked down at Lord Ito's lifeless body, the once powerful warlord reduced to a broken husk. The curse had claimed him, just as it would claim anyone else who stood in its way. With grim resolve, Jin turned and left the estate, the whispers still echoing in his mind. The final confrontation with the lost samurai was inevitable. But this time, Jin would be ready. The wind howled as Jin Sakai ascended the narrow, jagged path leading to Ghost's Peak. The mountain loomed above him, a monolith of stone and shadow, its summit obscured by swirling fog. Lightning crackled across the darkened sky, momentarily illuminating the treacherous cliffs and the endless void below. Every step Jin took was deliberate, measured, but the weight of the cursed mask hanging from his belt was a constant reminder that there was no turning back. Ghost's Peak, the place where it all began. The place where the lost samurai had been betrayed, cut down by his comrades under the pretense of peace. Jin could feel the spirit's presence growing stronger with each step, as if the mountain itself was alive with the ghost's rage. The air grew colder, and the whispers that had haunted him since the moment he touched the mask became louder, more insistent. They swirled around him like a storm, voices from the past, voices filled with anger, betrayal, and vengeance. His heart pounded in his chest, the rhythm matching the distant roll of thunder. The final confrontation was near, the moment that would decide not just his fate, but the fate of Iki Island. He could feel the spirit watching him, waiting, pulling him toward the peak as though Jin had no will of his own. Jin's mind raced, replaying the events that had led him here. The cursed mask, the haunted temple, Lord Ito's broken body lying lifeless in the estate. Every step had been paved in blood and fear, but now the end was in sight. The lost samurai's curse would either be broken tonight, or Jin would fall like the others. As he neared the summit, the air became unnaturally still. The wind that had battered him moments before fell silent, and the oppressive weight of the spirit's presence descended upon him. His breath came in shallow bursts, his muscles tense with anticipation. He could see the shrine now, a crumbling stone structure at the top of the peak, standing sentinel over the island. It was there, at that altar where the samurai had been betrayed, where he had drawn his last breath. And now his restless soul waited. Jin stepped into the clearing, his katana at his side, ready for whatever came next. The fog shifted around him, thick and unnatural, and in its center the ghost appeared. The lost samurai stood before the altar, his armor tattered and broken, stained with the blood of battles long past. The mask Jin had carried was already on the spirit's face, its hollow eyes staring into the void. The air around the ghost shimmered with an ethereal energy, dark and twisted. For a moment, neither of them moved, the silence between them thick with tension. But Jin could feel the weight of the spirit's gaze upon him, cold and unforgiving. "You came," the ghost rasped, its voice like the whisper of wind over a battlefield littered with the dead. "You carry the burden of betrayal just as I did." Jin's jaw tightened. "I'm not like you." The ghost tilted its head, the mask's eyes glinting in the dim light. "Aren't you? How many have you killed in the name of vengeance? How many lives have you destroyed?" Jin's fingers tightened around the hilt of his sword. The faces of the people he had cut down flashed through his mind. Mongol soldiers, bandits, traitors. Each one had fallen to his blade, and each one had carried their own reasons for fighting, their own justifications. But Jin had never questioned them. He had simply done what was necessary to survive, to protect Tsushima. "I fought to save my people," Jin said, his voice steady, though the doubt in his heart threatened to creep in. "You betrayed yours." "I was betrayed," the ghost spat, the air around it pulsing with anger. "I trusted them, and they drove their swords into my back. I was left to die alone, my name cursed, my soul bound to this wretched place. You think you're different, but the path you walk is the same as mine. You too will be consumed by vengeance." Jin shook his head. "I've seen what vengeance does to men. It poisons them, turns them into monsters. I won't let it consume me." The ghost's laughter was a cold, hollow sound that echoed off the mountainside. "It already has. You carry the blood of the fallen in your hands, just as I do. The mask was meant for you, Ghost of Tsushima." With that, the ghost lunged, faster than Jin could have anticipated. His katana flashed in the lightning-lit night, parrying the ghost's spectral blade with a sharp clang. The force of the blow sent Jin stumbling back, his feet sliding on the loose stones beneath him. The ghost pressed forward, striking again and again, each attack filled with a fury that bordered on madness. Jin gritted his teeth, deflecting the ghost's strikes, but each one felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of the ghost's hatred was bearing down on him. His muscles strained, his breath ragged. The ghost was relentless, and Jin knew that if he let his guard down for even a moment, it would be over. But he couldn't win this fight with strength alone. As the ghost swung at him again, Jin ducked beneath the blow and rolled to the side, giving himself a moment's reprieve. His mind raced, searching for a way to end this. The mask was the key. The spirit's soul was bound to it, tethered to this world by the betrayal it had suffered. Destroying the mask was the only way to free the ghost. But as Jin looked at the spirit, its rage so palpable, he realized the truth. The ghost didn't want freedom. It wanted blood. It wanted him to suffer, to feel the same pain, the same betrayal. Jin rose to his feet, his eyes locked on the ghost. This ends now. The ghost charged again, but this time Jin didn't meet its attack. Instead, he sidestepped, moving closer to the altar, where the mask had been placed. The ghost followed, its movements frenzied, its strikes wild. Jin could feel the rage emanating from it, a suffocating cloud of hatred and sorrow. With a final burst of speed, Jin closed the distance and grabbed the mask from the altar. The moment his fingers touched the cold porcelain, the ghost let out a deafening roar, its form flickering like a dying flame. Jin knew what had to be done. Without hesitation, he raised the mask high and brought it crashing down on the stone altar. The mask shattered with a sharp crack, the porcelain splintering into 1,000 pieces. The moment it broke, the air around them exploded with a force that nearly knocked Jin off his feet. The ghost screamed, a sound so full of anguish and pain that it seemed to tear through the very fabric of the night. Its form began to disintegrate, the armor and the spectral flesh peeling away like smoke in the wind. Jin staggered back, watching as the ghost dissolved, its essence slowly fading into the fog. For a brief moment, its eyes, now human, now full of sorrow, met Jin's. "Peace," the ghost whispered, its voice a mere breath. And then it was gone. The mountain fell silent once more. The oppressive weight lifted, the whispers vanished, and the cold, biting wind that had hounded Jin since his arrival subsided. Jin stood alone in the clearing, his heart still racing, his breath still heavy. The curse was broken. The lost samurai had been freed. Jin looked down at the shattered remains of the mask, the final vestige of the spirit's anger. He had won, but the ghost's words echoed in his mind. How many lives had he taken in the name of justice? How many more would fall by his hand before the end? As the first light of dawn began to break through the clouds, Jin turned his back on Ghost's Peak and began the long descent. He had broken the curse, but the burden of his actions would follow him. The island was free of the ghost, but Jin knew that no matter how far he traveled, he could never escape the ghosts of his past. The path of vengeance had no end.